These are very young children who spontaneously start talking about past lives. This does not involve hypnotic regression. These are young kids who just come out with this material, and they're not talking about being kings or queens, almost never talking about being famous people, but rather they're talking about someone who had an ordinary life, who died fairly recently, usually someone in the same country. And when I say recent, the average interval between the death of the previous person and the birth of the child is only 4.5 years. Some of them describe being deceased family members, like a grandparent, and I'm going to tell you about one of those. But others describe being strangers in other locations. And if they give enough details, like the name of the location, then people have often gone there and found that, in fact, somebody did live and die whose life matches the statements that the child has made. This is a little girl from India named Kumkum Verma. This is him and a couple of associates with her on a follow-up trip. She was actually a little girl when he met her. And she was from a village, but she began saying that she had lived in the city of Darbhanga, which was a city of a couple 100,000 people that was 25 miles away. And not just that she lived in Darbhanga, but she named the district of the city where she lived, and it was a district of artisans and craftsmen. Her family certainly didn't know anyone from there, but she told a lot of details about the life of a woman who had lived there. Her aunt wrote down some of her statements, and Ian was able to get a copy of her notes of 18 statements, and he got them translated, and they document that she gave the name of her son in that life, and the fact that he worked with a hammer, her grandson's name, the name of the town where her father lived, and some personal details like the fact that she had an iron safe at her home, that she had a sword hanging near the cot where she slept, and even that she had a pet snake that she fed milk to. So eventually, her father talked to a friend who had an employee from Darbhanga, and he was able to locate a woman who had died a few years before, whose life matched all the details that I just gave you. We've studied over 2,500 of them from all over the world, and I've listed the places where we have studied the most cases, and those are all places with a belief in reincarnation. But cases have been found wherever anyone has looked for them. They've been found on all the continents except Antarctica. This, unfortunately, is the previous person in this case. This is a young woman in Burma who was born with a congenital heart defect, and then when she was 20, she died during open heart surgery. After she was died, 3 of her classmates volunteered to prepare the body for cremation. They'd heard about bodies being marked, so they took some red lipstick and made marks on the back of her neck. And then a year later, her older sister gave birth to a girl with a birthmark. She had made statements about the previous life. She had, in fact, been asked to be called by the previous person's name. She would call her mom the term for older sister, and other family members, similar kinds of names. The average age when the kids start talking about a past life is 35 months. And some of them will do it in sort of a detached way, but others show a lot of emotion connected with this material. They may beg to be taken to the previous family. Sometimes they will cry on a daily basis about the people they miss. Some of them will show a lot of anger, particularly if the previous person is murdered. There's one case that I studied in Thailand where a group of young men had gone hunting, and one of them had accidentally shot and killed another one in an accident. And then a few years later, this little boy was born in the same village. And when he was 2, he tried to choke the guy who had accidentally shot the previous person. They don't tend to come out with enlightened words of wisdom. They don't tend to be little mystics. Some of them will make some philosophical statements, but what they do more is focus on events and people from near the end of the previous life. So 3/4 of them will talk about how the previous person died, and they will also talk about the people they knew at the end. So if a child is remembering the life of an adult, they'll be much more likely to talk about a spouse or children rather than talk about parents. So it seems it's as if the memory has just sort of picked up where it left off at the end of the last life. And then about 20% of the kids, most of them don't, but about 20% will talk about events between lives, between the death of the previous person and their birth. Some of them will talk about hanging around the previous family and observing things. Some will talk about the funeral that the previous person had. There's one little girl in Thailand who made a lot of statements, but one of them, she complained that her ashes had been scattered rather than buried the way that she wanted them to be. And it turned out that she had asked to have her ashes buried under the bow tree of the temple complex where she studied, but when her daughter went to bury them, the root system of the tree was so extensive that she couldn't bury them, so she scattered them instead. And then some of the kids will also talk about going to other realms like heaven, and the American kids may use the words heaven. And then some will talk about either being guided to their next parents or even choosing their next parents. And then some will talk about events occurring during the pregnancy. In the unnatural death cases, over 35% of the children will show an intense fear toward the mode of death of the previous person. So for instance, there was a little girl who basically from the time she was born, she hated being in water. And it would take 3 adults to hold her down to give her a bath. Then when she got old enough to talk, she described the life of a girl in another village who had drowned in an accident. Cross-gender behavior. About 10% of the children will talk about a past life as a member of the opposite sex. And many of those that do will show some gender confusion or gender dysphoria. The case I showed you, the experimental birthmark with the boy with the mark down the back of his neck who was thought to be his grandmother reborn, he said many times how he wanted to be a girl. And he was always dressing up in his mom's clothes and wearing her lipstick and that sort of thing. So we actually published that as a case of gender dysphoria. When we set up our website in 1998, since then we have been hearing from more and more American parents, and we hear from them all the time now. Most of them say that they had no belief in reincarnation before their kids started saying these things, and some of them were quite appalled by the idea of reincarnation. There's one mom I talked to who said she felt like she was committing a sin just to buy a book on reincarnation. But she could not ignore, in that case, she certainly could not ignore the things that her daughter was saying. And the American ones prove that this is not some cultural phenomenon that just takes place in places with a belief in reincarnation, because they take place here in a culture without a general belief and take place in families without a belief in reincarnation. So what do we make of these cases? I think with cases like this, to my way of thinking, they are too hard to ignore. And they are certainly evidence that consciousness continues on after the physical body dies. But it is worth keeping in mind that these are special cases, and they're special in the sense that intact memories have come through, and they're also special in the sense that the previous person tended to die young or die violently. So, and that the previous person came back very quickly. So it's possible that what we're seeing is simply one very end of the bell curve. And the patterns that we see may not be representative of the normal process. Now, of course, it may be that the rest of us don't necessarily come back here anyway. But even if we do, it may not be that we come back within 16 months or that sort of thing. But obviously, regardless of that, the cases do contribute significant evidence, along with other fields of evidence, that the mainstream materialist view of reality is incorrect. And it challenges us, I think, to take a different view of reality, one that I believe is consistent with quantum theory. And I'm not, that's a topic of another lecture, but I do want to quote from Max Planck, who's considered the founder of quantum theory. And he said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness." I would argue, and I do argue at the end of my book, that quantum theory has shown that the physical world is a creation of consciousness, that consciousness is what is primary, and the physical world grows out of it. If it does, then, then how does that work? And of course, synchronicity is really a way to try to look at all that. But the pieces all fit together to create something that was quite meaningful. Our cases seem to suggest that these are separate individuals kind of having a separate individual journey. But what I would argue instead is that the consciousness that each of us has seems to be linked to the consciousnesses that everyone has. And it may in fact be that we are all part of the same thing, that we are all individual streams of thought, but that we're all coming from one great mind. And if so, then I would say that it's worth keeping in mind that we are certainly all in this together.